Well, good day and welcome all to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. Some of you will know that this is our 200th anniversary. We were here in 1824, and we've made this a very special year. So we have an exhibition downstairs, and we have lots of exciting talks. And for those of you interested in Shakespeare, we did put out this leaflet to remind you that we have a talk on Shakespeare's sonnet coming up. So hopefully you'll be looking out for that. So I turn it over to Diane for all the information.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our celebration of William Shakespeare's birthday 460 years ago. It is an honour and a privilege for Bath Shakespeare Society, along with Brilsey, to be hosting this event. And thank you, Brilsey, once again for all your help and support. Now, without more ado, I would like to invite the Right Worshipful, the Mayor of Bath, Councillor Dina Romero, to share her thoughts with us. Madam Mayor.
Well, I must admit, I'm slightly alarmed. Well, I think maybe you should be alarmed that I've been asked to share my thoughts, because that could be almost anything, couldn't it? To be honest with you, the first thing I was actually thinking about was, so for the fans of Shakespeare, perhaps there ought to be a collective name for you, very much like Taylor Swift has Swifties. Maybe we should call you the Bardsters. Anyway, good afternoon. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. Such a quote from Julius Caesar is probably obligatory because we are here in the city of Bath with its Roman heritage. Today is a national day of celebration, of course, of St. George, patron saint of England, but also of the life and works of the bard, William Shakespeare, who was born and died on this day, the 23rd of April. In his 52 years, Shakespeare wrote 39 plays and 154 sonnets, as well as contributing and collaborating on other writings and verse. His plays have been translated into every major living language, and he is the most often performed playwright. Shakespeare remains arguably the most influential writer in the English language, with his works continually studied and reinterpreted. I expect you know that the word bard refers to a friend who writes poetry, which sounds relatively safe until you recall that Shakespeare was a great commentator on the human condition. But as Shakespeare's father, who I learn was also a mayor, may well have advised me, mayors are not supposed to be political. So I will not quote lines from perhaps King Lear on the homeless or on refugees, but will focus instead on such plays as Measure for Measure, where we are told, "It is excellent to have a giant's strength, but it is tyrannous to use it like a giant." Or from Henry V, where a good heart, Kate, is the sun and the moon, or rather the sun and not the moon, for it shines bright and never changes. From Macbeth, we take a recognition of the smallness and temporary nature of our own existence. In all a world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. That's a theme that is again considered in The Tempest, where we are such stuff as dreams are made on. And then drawing on more philosophy, obviously, to be or not to be. That is indeed the question from Hamlet, which we may well find ourselves asking. So perhaps we might settle on another line from Hamlet, "To thine own self be true." But I think my favourite, which is from Henry VIII, remains, I think this one remains my favourite. "Good company, good wine, and good welcome can make good people." And that feels like a very good point to end my short speech and thoughts upon. Thank you.
That was lovely. Thank you. And now on to our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Peter Davies. Peter is a former chairman of the Bath Shakespeare Society, a post he held for 9 years. Since his school days, he has enjoyed reading and acting in Shakespeare. He taught English and drama in secondary schools in New Zealand and England and has directed many plays, including Shakespeare, in schools and amateur theatre societies. For 20 years, he was a lay reader in the Anglican Church. His primary research interest is in the transition in the language of worship from Tudor Stuart English to modern English. Peter's talk today is entitled By the Mass.
Madam Mayor, Madam Chairman, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Mayor, for mentioning two plays in particular, the Henry VIII, which I shall be talking about towards the end of my talk, and also the one that you started with, Julius Caesar, which we're talking about anniversaries. 60 years ago, almost to the day, I directed Julius Caesar in Stratford upon Partia in New Zealand. It was a school production, and the boy who played Julius Caesar became quite famous later on, not as an actor, but as a rugby player. So I suppose being attacked by 15 conspirators in the capital would have been quite a good preparation for his future career. It seems to me that in recent years, there's been an increasing interest in literary biography, in which a writer's work is linked with events in a writer's life. In Shakespeare's case, this is difficult, as so little is known for sure about his life. Even so, this hasn't slowed the continuous flow of books about Shakespeare. I recently read a fascinating work by the great Shakespearean scholar, Stanley Wells, entitled, "What Was Shakespeare Really Like?" Now that's a question we'd all like to know the answer to that. I enjoyed Stanley Wells's work. It's quite illuminating, based mainly on the texts. However, there's one point where I disagree with him, and I'll tell you what that is later. This afternoon, I'd like to concentrate on two questions. First, was Shakespeare a secret Roman Catholic? And secondly, how are the religious issues of his day reflected in Shakespeare's plays? From time to time, I'll project onto the screen a short quotation, and I'll invite you to identify it. And I'm going to start with the first line of one of his plays. So shaken as we are, so one with care. What play and who says it? Oh, I'm surprised, I'm astonished. Nobody like to guess? Ah, thank you, Alison. Yes, Henry IV, Part 1. And the speaker? Henry IV, yes. He goes on, Henry goes on. So shaken as we are, so one with care, find we a time for frighted peace to pant, and breathe short-winded accents of new broils to be commenced in stronds afar remote. Why is he in such a bad mood? Because of wars threatened by the French and launched by the Scots and Welsh. He speaks about his long-held ambition to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and drive the pagan hordes from these holy fields. But the Earl of Westmoreland brings further bad news. Mortimer's army has been defeated by Owen Glendower, and the Hotspur family are threatening trouble in Northumberland. Sadly, Henry realizes that his planned pilgrimage to the Holy Land will have to wait. In fact, he never achieves it. Towards the end of Henry IV, Part 2, the king, on his deathbed, confesses to his son, Prince Hal, that he has acquired the crown from his predecessor, Richard II, by indirect and crooked ways. and now is about to die, not in the Holy Land, but in a room called Jerusalem. In the next play in the sequence, King Henry V, just before the Battle of Agincourt, the former Prince Hal, now the king, kneels down and prays, "Not today, O Lord. Oh, not today. Think not upon the fault my father made in compassing the crown." Later, he tells us that he has reinterred Richard II's body, paid 500 poor people to pray twice a day for Richard's soul, and has built 2 chantries where priests will pray for Richard and also seek heavenly pardon for himself. In Shakespeare's plays, there are 15 occurrences of the oath by the Mass, 9 of them in the Henry IV plays. Justice Shallow swears by the Mass 4 times in one conversation with Falstaff. All these utterances are light-hearted. By the 1590s, the phrase had already lost its literal meaning, just as other oaths have. Even so, in the wrong context, in the time of Elizabeth I, by the Mass was a dangerous thing to say. The Roman Catholic Mass had been banned since 1559. To take part in a Mass, or worse, to organize a Mass, was a capital offence. In 1592, Swithin Wells, tutor to the Earl of Southampton, was hanged outside his London house because a Mass had been held there in his absence. Pilgrimages had been officially regarded as superstitious nonsense since Elizabeth's accession. Shakespeare makes several references to pilgrims. For instance, in Act 1 of Henry IV, Part 1, Poins refers to a party of pilgrims carrying rich spoils to Canterbury. And here's a question for you. In which of Shakespeare's plays does a character disguise herself as a pilgrim of St. James? Yeah, All's Well, yeah. And what's her name? Helena, yes, that's it, thank you. She disguises herself for safety. Actually, she's no intention of heading for Santiago. She's pursuing her fugitive husband, Bertram, who was last heard of going in the direction of Italy. If you haven't seen The Cake yet, well, you'll get a chance to see it before it's cut. That is a reference to Helena, All's Well that Ends Well. It's a depiction of the cross of St. James and a cockle shell. Cockle shell was carried by pilgrims who went to Santiago de Compostela. It's a lovely cake, and take a good look at it before we cut it up and eat it. In Romeo and Juliet, the first conversation between the lovers is about palms and palmers and pilgrims. Juliet says, "For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss." Shakespeare wrote 10 plays about English history, and all but one of them was set well before the Reformation. The exception is King Henry VIII. More about that later. How did the first audiences respond to these references to Roman Catholic practices? How many of them were Catholics in secret and regularly celebrated the Mass? At this point, I need to take a look at some of the key events in the history of the Reformation. It's usual to locate the beginning of the English Reformation with the Act of Royal Supremacy, passed in 1534, 1 year after Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon and his marriage to Anne Boleyn. But I think we need to go back a further 150 years to the preaching and writing of an Oxford professor of philosophy, John Wycliffe. According to Wycliffe, the supreme authority on Christian doctrine was the Bible, not the church. Purgatory, he maintained, was a medieval invention designed to frighten people into obedience. In the Mass, transubstantiation, or the conversion of bread and wine into the body and blood of Jesus, was a hoax perpetrated by the clergy. Wycliffe encouraged private individual prayer, and his followers were called lollards because of their habit of mumbling prayers as they walked along. Lollardism was easily suppressed, and Wycliffe was declared a heretic in 1415. But his ideas survived, and his criticism of the church re-emerged with the teaching of Martin Luther in Germany, Calvin in Geneva, Zwingli in Zurich, and eventually Thomas Cranmer in England. King Henry VIII, urged by Thomas Cromwell and Anne Boleyn, introduced reformed religion into England. The Act of Royal Supremacy declared Henry to be the supreme head of the church in England, not yet of England. In 1537, all churches were obliged to buy a copy of the Great Bible in English and to display it on a lectern. At the same time, monasteries throughout the land were being dissolved and the buildings sold to Henry's wealthy supporters, and the monks and nuns pensioned off. The cult of saints was abolished, and many public holidays were discontinued. None of this was popular with the public, and by the end of his life, Henry himself was beginning to fear that reform had gone too far. From 1543, only the upper classes were allowed to read the Bible. Henry died in 1547, and with the succession of his son, the 9-year-old Prince Edward, the Reformation went into overdrive. In the early 1550s, several grammar schools were established. Many of them have survived as King Edward VI schools. There's one in this city. There was already a grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon, and it was granted a new charter in 1550. The government wanted to create a well-educated Protestant middle class in England. The destruction of statues, shrines, elaborate decorations in churches continued with vigor. Walls were whitewashed and stained glass windows destroyed. In 1549, Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, introduced a new prayer book. In the second edition, in 1552, it was radical in three important ways. First, it was in English, not Latin. Secondly, the prayers to and for the dead were abolished. This included the much-loved prayer, Ave Maria, or Hail Mary. The funeral rite was very much shorter than the traditional Requiem Mass. You may recall that Horatio's last words to the dying Hamlet are, "Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest." This is hardly a funeral service, but it's more Catholic than Protestant, with its reference to heavenly rest, Requiem aeternam. Thirdly, and to many most shockingly, the Mass was replaced by Holy Communion, or the Lord's Supper. In his introduction, Cranmer stressed that the elements remained bread and wine throughout the service and were definitely not transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Edward VI died in 1553, aged 15, and was succeeded by his half-sister, Mary, aged 37. And very quickly, the English Reformation went into reverse. The restoration of Catholicism was not entirely unwelcome. Cranmer's prayer book had provoked protests in East Anglia and the West. The Cornish people, especially those whose first language was Cornish, objected to the imposition of the English language. They preferred the Latin. it soon became apparent that to be a Protestant in Mary's England was dangerous. Thousands, including hundreds of clergy, fled to Geneva and the Protestant parts of Germany. This escape route was not available to Cranmer. He was imprisoned for 2 years, and then in 1556, alongside 2 other bishops, Latimer and Ridley, he was publicly burned in Oxford. Altogether, in Mary's reign, a total of 273 Protestants were burned at the stake. Mary died in 1558 and was succeeded by her half-sister, the 25-year-old Elizabeth. Under the guidance of her stepmother, Catherine Parr, Elizabeth had received a Protestant education, and it was expected that she would restore Protestantism. This is what she did, and the Church of England became the established religion. Elizabeth had wanted to be more tolerant of other forms of Christianity, but she was soon persuaded by her chief minister, William Cecil, that this was a bad idea. Catholics, he argued, are your enemies. Their allegiance is to the Pope, not you, and they need to be suppressed. It was not long before Cecil was proved right. Up until 1587, there were at least 6 plots to murder Elizabeth and to replace her with a Catholic monarch. In 1569, in Durham Cathedral, prayer books were torn up and burnt. It was not only the Catholics who caused trouble for Elizabeth and Cecil. In 1559, there was an influx of clergy who had fled from Mary's Catholic regime. Back they came with newfound enthusiasm for the Calvinism which they had encountered in Geneva. Elizabeth had no taste for high-temperature religion. She preferred dignity and beauty in worship. She kept the governing structure of cathedrals. She liked clergy and choirs to be robed. She loved church music. William Byrd, who made no secret of his Catholicism, continued to be one of her favorite composers. But this Calvinism, or Puritanism, as it was later called, was not the main threat. In spite of their distaste for ceremony, Puritans acknowledged the authority of the monarch as the head of the church. For the rest of Elizabeth's reign, Catholics were increasingly subjected to repression and persecution. In 1570, Elizabeth was excommunicated by papal bull, and Catholics were told that they no longer owed allegiance to the heretic on the English throne. Cecil's response was to bring before Parliament an act which declared Catholics to be traitors. Recusants, that is, people who refused to attend church, were subject to a fine of £20 a month. Now, that's an enormous amount of money. Non-payers of this recusancy fine forfeited 2/3 of their property. In 1587, Mary Queen of Scots, after 20 years' imprisonment in various castles in the North and Midlands, was executed. She had been accused of initiating the Babington Plot against Queen Elizabeth. Whether the evidence against her was genuine or had been invented, we shall never know. Her death meant the removal of a focal point and figurehead for Catholicism in England. It also provoked outrage in Catholic Europe, and Philip II of Spain was at last persuaded to invade England. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was good news for Elizabeth and very bad news for English Catholics. Persecution and victimization of Catholics continued for the rest of the century and beyond. In the 1590s, speculation about the succession increased. As soon as it became clear that James VI of Scotland would be the next King of England, the Puritans thought that he would be more sympathetic to their cause, because he was the head of the Calvinist Kirk in Scotland. The Catholics, too, had great expectations of a monarch whose wife was a Catholic and whose mother was Mary Queen of Scots. But the Gunpowder Plot in 1605 was the end of the story for Catholics. The Puritans, too, were disappointed by James's enthusiasm for Anglicanism. Their time would come later on with the rise of Oliver Cromwell. The critic Frank Kermode reckoned that in 1600, the population of England consisted of 5% Catholic, 40% Puritan, and the rest Church of England. But this was only a guess. A great many ordained clergy were also Puritans. An unknown number of Catholics had escaped persecution and gone into exile in the Spanish Netherlands, and many others became church Catholics, who went to church on Sunday mornings and held secret masses in their own homes. In 1569, Sir Ralph Sadler, an elder statesman of the last four reigns and one-time custodian of Mary Queen of Scots, reckoned that the Protestant faith was only skin deep. The ancient faith still lay like lees at the bottom of men's hearts. If the vessel was ever so little stirred, it comes to the top. What about Shakespeare? To which one of these groups, if any, did he belong? In 1999, a conference on the theme of the Lancastrian Shakespeare took place at the University of Lancaster. Among the many articles and books which emerged from this gathering was a monograph by a Jesuit priest, Peter Millward, entitled The Catholicism of Shakespeare's Plays. Millward speculates that when Edmund Campion, a leading Jesuit priest, returned to England in 1580, he visited Catholic friends in Warwickshire on his way to another Catholic household at Houghton Towers in Lancashire. This points to a strong possibility, I'm quoting Millward here, of a meeting in Stratford between Campion and the young Shakespeare. Campion, he speculates, could have persuaded young William to accompany him to Houghton Towers, where he would have been employed as a schoolteacher. In 1581, Houghton made his will, and in it left an annuity to a servant called William Shakeshaft, and a recommendation to his neighbour, Sir Thomas Hesketh, a prominent Catholic and a patron of the arts, who lived nearby at Rufford Hall. Shakeshaft, Houghton wrote, would make a good teacher and a possible actor. We don't know whether Hesketh followed up this suggestion. Is it possible that Shakeshaft and Shakespeare are the same man? Yes, it is possible. Is it likely? My answer is no. Frank Kermode suggests that if Shakespeare had wished to make his presence in a Catholic household secret, then surely he would have chosen a more obscure pseudonym. Bill Bryson, in his book on Shakespeare's life, maintains that this Lancastrian adventure would have left insufficient time for Will to return to Stratford, to court, impregnate, and then in May 1582, marry Anne Hathaway. A common theme which emerged from the Lancaster University conference was the presence in the text of many of Shakespeare's plays of secret messages for the comfort and encouragement of Roman Catholics. I've just got time to mention one of these. What play and who says it? True it is that we have seen better days. True it is that we've seen better days. Everybody's going until I get the answer to this. Well, this is I'll give you a few more lines, 3 more lines. True it is that we've seen better days, and have with holy bell been knolled to church, and sat at good men's feasts, and wiped our eyes of drops that sacred pity hath engendered. No. As you like it, this is Duke Senior. As you like it. The Duke had been deposed by his brother Frederick and has been banished with his followers to the Forest of Arden. According to the theory of the secret messages for Catholics, Duke Senior and his company are Catholics who have escaped not to Arden, but to Ardennes in the Spanish Netherlands. Duke Frederick represents the upstart Church of England. The women, Rosalind and Celia, are the agents of reconciliation. In the end, Duke Frederick meets an old man in the forest and is converted to true religion. And Duke Senior, that is Roman Catholicism, is restored to his dukedom. Now for a complete contrast. In the play King John, there's an eloquent attack on the Pope in a speech addressed by the king to the Pope's legate, Cardinal Pandulph. What earthly name to interrogatories can taste the free breath of a sacred king? Thou canst not, Cardinal, devise a name so slight, unworthy, and ridiculous to charge me to an answer as the Pope. Tell him this tale, and from the mouth of England add thus much more, that no Italian priest shall tithe or toll in our dominions, but as we under God, our supreme head, so under him that great supremacy, where we do reign, we will alone uphold without the assistance of a mortal hand. So tell the Pope, all reverence set aside, to him and his usurped authority. This is the sort of thing that Henry VIII would say 300 years later. So there's a contrast here between the covert support for Catholics in As You Like It and the open anti-papal abuse in King John. Whether or not the Roman Catholics in Shakespeare's audience would recognize or take comfort from the coded messages of support is impossible to tell. What is certain is that Catholics were treated as heretics and traitors in Elizabethan England. The Pope was referred to as the devil's agent or antichrist. Luther called the Pope an impostor. To Wycliffe, the Mass was a devilish perversion of a spiritual gift of God. And later, in the 1590s, it was commonly referred to as the Popish dunghill. To the Vatican, all Protestants were heretics, and all Protestant leaders and monarchs were excommunicated. Nevertheless, it's sometimes difficult to remember that all these warring groups were aspects of the same religion, Christianity. Open atheists, like Christopher Marlowe, were extremely rare. Practically everyone was a Christian of one kind or another. They all had the same spiritual preoccupations. How should I conduct my life? How can I be certain of God's favor? If I commit sins, how can I confess and obtain absolution? What will happen to my soul when I die? The play Othello takes place in a Christian context. At one point, Othello's lieutenant, Cassio, says to Iago, "God's above all, and there be souls to be saved, and there are souls that must not be saved." Iago, too, says that he hopes to be saved. Earlier, he tells Roderigo, "Heaven is my judge," but then immediately adds, "I am not what I am." And later, when he's alone, likens himself to a divinity of hell. There are no priests in Othello, but Shakespeare's lists of characters include many clergy. I seem to have missed one slide. No, it's missing. No, the next slide would have been Shakespeare's clergy. 7 archbishops, 5 of Canterbury, 2 of York, 8 bishops, 5 cardinals, 9 priests, including 1 Welsh parson, 1 abbess, 4 friars, and 1 pretend friar. As far as I can see, the only one of these who gives any spiritual guidance is the pretend friar, who, in Measure for Measure, is the Duke of Vienna in disguise. It is he who, in the manner of a Jesuit priest, advises Isabella on how to avoid breaking her vow of chastity, and tells her brother Claudio to prepare for death. The priests in Twelfth Night and As You Like It just happen to be conveniently available to conduct a marriage. Friar Lawrence, in Romeo and Juliet, arranges a stratagem for Juliet to defy her parents by marrying Romeo instead of Count Paris. His cunning plan results in the deaths of Romeo, Juliet, and Paris. In King Henry V, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in a speech of 81 lines, explains to the king how he can justifiably invade France and claim the French throne for himself. In performance, this long-winded peroration is usually cut, or sometimes it's played for laughs. In the Henry IV plays, the Archbishop of York joins the rebel side with his own private army. In King Richard III, the king arranges for himself to be seen in public, standing between 2 bishops and reading a prayer book. According to the Duke of Buckingham, he wishes to be seen as a holy man, full of devotion and right Christian zeal. The bishops are simply stage props. It seems, therefore, that for spiritual and moral enlightenment in the plays, we must look elsewhere. I come back to 2 of the questions which I suggested were frequently at the front of people's minds. How can I obtain forgiveness of sins and achieve salvation? What will happen to my soul after death? The doctrine of purgatory arose in the 12th century. In purgatory, souls could serve penance for their sins, achieve forgiveness, and admittance to heaven. Time in purgatory could be shortened by going on a pilgrimage or by acts of charity, such as the establishment of chantries before your death, and even after death by prayers by your surviving relatives. In many of Shakespeare's plays, the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead becomes more permeable. For instance, in Hamlet, the ghost of Hamlet's father appears on the battlements of Elsinore. Hamlet is terrified that this ghost might be sent by the devil. Be thou a spirit of health or a goblin damned. He calls for heavenly protection. Right, this one's missing. Anyway, I'll tell you what it is. Hamlet says, when he sees the ghost, angels and ministers of something defend us. What's the missing word? Grace. Yes, very good. Who said that? Bob. Oh, Roger, thank you. Grace. The doctrine of heavenly grace goes back to St. Augustine, who said that humanity was essentially fallen, and each individual depended on God's grace for salvation. One of the 39 articles of the Church of England, revised in 1563, specifically denied the existence of purgatory. Even so, Shakespeare's characters refer to purgatory in Othello, 1603, and in Hamlet, 1601. The ghost gives a blood-curdling description of what it's like to be in purgatory. The ghost of Hamlet's father is unusual, and that it is also seen by Horatio and 3 soldiers. But the ghost has a message which is for Hamlet's ears only. Remember me. As we have seen in the Henry IV plays, a crime can lead to a sense of guilt, confession, sorrow, and a wish to make amends. Shakespeare's villains tend not to repent. One of Richard III's last acts is to order the beheading of the son of Lord Stanley. He says of himself, "Conscience is but a word which cowards use." Iago is another for whom repentance is impossible. On being confronted with his crimes, he simply says, "Demand me nothing." King Claudius, however, is full of remorse when his part in the murder of old Hamlet is revealed to the court by the players. When he is alone, he prays, "Oh, my offence is rank. It smells to heaven. It hath the primal eldest curse upon it, a brother's murder." So Claudius confesses his sin. However, the opportunity to confess was denied to his victim. The ghost of King Hamlet laments that he was murdered, unhouselled, disappointed, unannealed. Housel means the sacrament of the Mass. Unannealed means that he was denied the opportunity to seek absolution from a priest. Later, when Hamlet enters and sees his uncle at prayer, he doesn't kill him because he doesn't want to send him to heaven. He'd rather make sure of his eternal damnation. Now, the next slide should be Puritans, predestination and free will. So I don't know what's happened to that. Anyway, Puritans, predestination and free will. The two characters in Shakespeare who can clearly be identified as Puritans are Malvolio in Twelfth Night and Angelo in Measure for Measure. They both seem to be austere and joyless, but both reveal themselves as supreme hypocrites. Malvolio's humiliation is very funny on stage, but Angelo is much more sinister. In the final act, he is saved from the death sentence by the generosity of the woman who is the object of his sexual predation. Isabella forgives him and pleads for leniency from the Duke. She does this even before she knows that her brother Claudio is still alive. There's a lot more to Puritanism than is shown in the behavior of Malvolio and Angelo. Earlier, I referred to the increasing strength of Puritans towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. This was partly due to the return of Protestant clergy from their exile in Geneva. Calvin, like Luther, and before them St. Augustine, believed that God exercised detailed control over all history and shaped it for his divine purpose at the end of the world. Salvation could not be earned or bought. It was the responsibility of individuals to reflect on their own behavior and to examine their conscience. No one can know whether he or she is to be saved. All they can do is to try to ensure that they are worthy of God's saving grace. Another historian of the Reformation, Kenneth Morgan, suggests that by the 1590s, the prevailing religious climate had shifted towards private prayer, subjectivity, and self-scrutiny. This, I think, can be seen in the soliloquies of some of Shakespeare's later characters. Hamlet and Macbeth, for instance, are far more self-analytical than Richard III and Richard II. The three weird sisters, as they are called, confront Macbeth and Banquo with a vision of the future. If you can look into the seeds of time, speaker? Banquo. He goes on, if you can look into the seeds of time, speaking to the witches, and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me, who neither beg nor fear your favours nor your hate. They do indeed speak to Banquo and foretell that he will be the father of kings. Later, after Banquo's murder, they reveal much more to Macbeth. After the appearance of 3 apparitions, there's a procession of kings. Will the line stretch out to the crack of doom, cries Macbeth, fearful that he is about to see a revelation of the end of the world. Even in Act 1, Macbeth is only too well aware of the monstrosity of the sins he is about to commit. He knows already that Duncan's virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued, against the deep damnation of his taking off. Just after the vision of the dagger, Macbeth is startled by the ringing of a bell. To his wife, the owl, harbinger of death, is the fatal bellman. The bell is Macbeth's cue to go and murder the king. I go, and it is done. The bell invites me. Hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell. Finally, Macbeth is reduced to the nihilism of despair. They've tied me to a stake, I cannot fly, but bear-like I must fight the course. All the spectators would have been aware that in bear baiting, commonly seen in Elizabethan outdoor theatres, there's only one outcome for the bear, a painful death. The inevitability of fate is reflected also in Romeo and Juliet. Right from the prologue speech, we're aware of what will happen to the star-crossed lovers. Romeo, after he has killed Tybalt, sees himself as fortune's fool. In the final scene of King Lear, when Lear enters carrying Cordelia's body, Kent says, "Is this the promised end?" meaning the end of the world. And Edgar says, "Or image of that horror." Speaker? The porter, yes, thank you. The porter in Macbeth, immediately after the murder of Duncan. The porter imagines himself as the keeper of Hell's Gate, welcoming equivocators, who he says are people who swear in both the scales against either scale. This could refer to Jesuit priests who, on being interrogated in the Tower of London, were faced with the choice of being a heretic or a traitor. The idea was to avoid both, if you could, by being an equivocator. And now, as promised, I turn to the play King Henry VIII, or All is True. There are 2 main events in this play: the cross-examination of Queen Catherine of Aragon at the hearing of the Legatine Court in 1529, and the christening of the infant Elizabeth in September 1533. We're going to hear 2 speeches, the first by Queen Catherine, read by Diane, and the second by Thomas Cranmer, read by Michael. So here we are in the courtroom. Catherine, Queen of England, come into the court.
Sir, I desire you do me right and justice, and to bestow your pity on me. For I am a most poor woman and a stranger, born out of your dominions, having here no judge indifferent, nor no more assurance of equal friendship and proceeding. Alas, sir, in what have I offended you? What cause hath my behaviour given to your displeasure, that thus you should proceed to put me off and take your good grace from me? Heaven, witness, I have been to you a true and humble wife, at all times to your will conformable, ever in fear to kindle your dislike, yea, subject to your countenance, glad or sorry as I saw it inclined. When was the hour I ever contradicted your desire, or made it not my own too? Sir, call to mind that I have been your wife in this obedience upward of 20 years, and have been blessed with many children by you. If in the course and process of this time you can report and prove it too, against mine honour aught, my bond to wedlock, or my love and duty against your sacred person, in God's name turn me away, and let the foulest contempt shut door upon me, and so give me up to the sharpest kind of justice. Please you, sir, the king your father was reputed for a prince most prudent, of an excellent and unmatched wit and judgment. Ferdinand, my father, king of Spain, was reckoned one the wisest prince that there had reigned by many a year before. It is not to be questioned that they had gathered a wise council to them of every realm that did debate this business, who deemed my marriage lawful. Wherefore, I humbly beseech you, sir, to spare me till I may be by my friends in Spain advised, whose counsel I will implore. If not, in the name of God, your pleasure be fulfilled.
Thank you, Diane. And now, 4 years later, we're at the christening of the royal baby, Elizabeth. The newly appointed Archbishop Cranmer speaks. Your Grace.
Let me speak, sir, for heaven now bids me, and the words I utter, let none think flattery, for they'll find 'em truth. This royal infant, heaven still move about her, though in her cradle, yet now promises upon this land 1,000,000 blessings, which time shall bring to ripeness. She shall be, but few now living can behold that goodness, a pattern to all princes living with her and all that shall proceed. All princely graces that mould upon such a mighty piece as this is, with all the virtues that attend the good, shall still be doubled on her. Truth shall nurse her. Her foes shake like a field of beaten corn and hang their heads with sorrow. Good grows with her. In her days, every man shall eat in safety under his own vine what he plants, and sing the merry songs of peace to all his neighbors. God shall be truly known, and those about her from her shall read the perfect ways of honor, and by those claim their greatness, not by blood. She shall be the happiness of England. Nor shall this peace sleep with her, but as when the bird of wonder dies, the maiden phoenix, her ashes new create another heir as great in admiration as herself, so shall she leave her blessedness to one, when heaven shall call her from this cloud of darkness, who from the sacred ashes of her honor shall star-like rise, as great in fame as she was, and so stand fixed. Peace, plenty, love, truth, terror, that were the servant to this chosen infant, shall then be his, and like a vine grow to him. Wherever the bright sun of heaven shall shine, his honor and the greatness of his name shall be, and make new nations. He shall flourish, and like a mountain cedar, reach his branches to all the plains about him. Our children's children shall see this and bless heaven.
Thank you, Michael. Where do your sympathies lie? With the wronged Queen Catherine, the most famous Catholic woman in England, with the eloquent Protestant Archbishop, or with both of them? Note that both speakers claim to be speaking God's truth. Note also that Cranmer claims that in Elizabeth's reign, God shall be truly known. Critics have struggled with this play. It has been dismissed as a blatant piece of propaganda for Queen Elizabeth and her successor, King James. It has been suggested that Shakespeare's acting company, the King's Men, decided that Shakespeare had made the first half far too sympathetic towards Catholics and hired John Fletcher to redress the balance by rewriting the second half with a long speech in favour of the Protestant succession. Another suggestion is that the play is not by Shakespeare at all and doesn't belong in the canon. But the fact remains that Shakespeare's former colleagues, Hemmings and Condell, made the decision to include it in the first folio of 1623. I think that the play shows Shakespeare as a skilled equivocator. That is, someone who through his characters could assume any argument, occupy any position, give voice to any point of view. Finally, I come to Stanley Wells again, who wrote the book, What Was Shakespeare Really Like? Shakespeare hated Puritans, he said. I don't think he did hate Puritans. He reflected some Puritan sentiments, especially in the great tragedies. I'm not trying to make out that Shakespeare was a Puritan, any more than I'm saying that he was a Catholic, or an Anglican, or a Republican, or a Royalist, or a misogynist, or a feminist. All these points of view, and many more, can be found in the plays. I'd like to leave you with two short quotations. Michael Boyd, a former artistic director at the Royal Shakespeare Company. It's always dangerous to say, here is Shakespeare's mind. And the actor Roy Kinnear. Shakespeare disappears deliberately, magnificently into his characters. And so, Madam Chairman, he does.
Thank you, Peter. That was so much information in that and a lot for us to think about. And you've left us dangling. we have to decide for ourselves, I think. Are there any questions from the audience?
Time so that she didn't have to attend mass, and that might be an indication that she at least was Catholic.
Can you repeat that question to the people online? Because I didn't get the microphone to her in time.
Right, repeat the question. Yes, the question was about Shakespeare's daughter. She was named as a recusant. She was fined for not going to church. Does this indicate that she was a Catholic? Susanna appeared in the roles of recusants in 1606. And I think her husband did as well, John Hall, Dr. John Hall. To be a recusant, you just didn't turn up at church. There was no requirement to take part in Holy Communion. If you didn't turn up to church, you were on the recusant roll. But in the later on, it seems apparent that John Hall and Susanna were prominent Puritans. They were known as Puritans in Stratford-on-Avon. I don't think it actually does mean that she was a Catholic. It means that she just didn't go to church on one occasion. In 1606, that's the 1 year after the Gunpowder Plot, there was a real crackdown on recusants. That was much more strict than it had been in, say, 20 years earlier. So I think she just appeared there because she didn't go to church. My view is it doesn't show that she was a Catholic. I think she was more likely to be a Puritan sympathizer like her husband. Incidentally, I was wondering whether anyone would ask about Shakespeare's family. Shakespeare's father was also appeared on the role of recusants in 1592, and he claimed that he didn't go to church because he wanted to avoid his creditors. He owed a lot of money. In his early career, before the birth of his children, he was really quite a prominent man. He was an alderman, a senior alderman in Stratford-on-Avon, and he was no doubt prominent in what happened in the church, in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-on-Avon, that is the destruction of images, the whitewashing of the walls, and so on. So the fact that he appeared in the role of recusants doesn't prove that he was a Catholic. I'm inclined to take his excuse at face value that he was really in disgrace publicly, and that's why he didn't go to church. There's something also about Mary Arden, but I won't bother you about that. Mary Arden too is suspected of coming from a Catholic family, but I don't know what the evidence is, but it's certainly mentioned.
Anybody else? No more questions? What about Peter? Was it a will found? John Shakespeare's will was found up in an attic, or something was found that belonged to John Shakespeare. Have I got that right?
Yeah, it wasn't a will. It was a document. It was a Catholic tract. It was found in the attic of his house about 150 years after his death, but that has been lost. Nobody really knows what it was, but it was at the time it was said to be a Catholic tract, therefore suggesting that John Shakespeare was a Catholic. But that's really as far as it goes. I don't really think it proves anything, but it's one of these fascinating half details that leads to a lot of speculation.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I can't really take it any further than that.
No, thank you. No, it's just a thought I had. Anybody else like to ask anything or make any points? No? Right, well, at this point, we'd like to invite you to grab a glass of wine and I will invite Lady Mayor to make a toast to William on his birthday. So wine is being poured at the back. So if you'd like to make your way down there and get a glass, and then when everybody's equipped, we'll have our toast. Well, we'll have the toast and then I'll ask the Lady Mayor to cut the cake. So have a look at the cake before it's cut as well. Yes.